Harry Litman, the United States Supreme Court has to talk to the Trump regime like they're school children who are learning about the Constitution for the first time. That's not the way it's supposed to be. I mean, usually when you and I read Supreme Court decisions, we kind of get past, this is what the Fifth Amendment says. Due process means that you're entitled to a hearing. And we start getting into the complex layers of why a specific case is before the Supreme Court in the first place. But the issue is with this Trump regime, it's people like Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem and Trump and others who don't have law degrees, who don't have the most basic understanding of the Constitution, saying things like they want to suspend habeas corpus and saying things like they want to invoke the Alien Enemies Act of the late 18th century because they like the way it sounds. I mean, look, I'm not going to get political here or talk about other areas per se, but it's almost like, Donald Trump will like a word like Golden Dome. So he'll just be like, I like Golden Dome, I want Golden Dome. I like Alien Enemies Act, I want Alien Enemies Act. And we see it here. I mean, in the last week's Supreme Court ruling, where they are talking about how even migrants are entitled to due process, they have to explain it like baby, like they're talking to babies, and no offense to babies. I mean, in the order, the Fifth Amendment entitles aliens to due process of law in the context of removal proceedings. And the citation is to another Trump case that went before the Supreme Court. So they're like, we told you. What they're saying is, we told you this already. And that's like, if you're a lawyer, like that's what they really mean here. Procedural due process rules are meant to protect against the mistaken or unjustified deprivation of life, liberty, or property. We have long held that no person shall be removed from the United States without opportunity at some time to be heard, citing the Japanese immigrant case of 1903 involving internment camps. Due process requires notice that is reasonably calculated under the circumstances. Now, if we were to be doing a class on con law for a first-year law student, right, we would be explaining that maybe in the first class. But, it's why when you're questioning these Trump regime cabinet members at these congressional hearings, the Senate hearings, and the House hearings, I think you got to go back to the basics, and you got to just ask them the question of, do you know what this term habeas corpus even means? Do you know what it means, Kristi Noem? Because, Harry, they don't know what it means. Here's the clip of Senator Hassan asking this question of Kristi Noem. Let's play it.
So, Secretary Noem, what is habeas corpus?
Well, habeas corpus is a constitutional right that the president has to be able to remove people from this country and suspend their right to.
Let me stop you, ma'am. Habeas corpus, excuse me, that's incorrect.
President Lincoln used it.
Excuse me. Habeas corpus is the legal principle that requires that the government provide a public reason for detaining and imprisoning people. If not for that protection, the government could simply arrest people, including American citizens, and hold them indefinitely for no reason. Habeas corpus is the foundational right that separates free societies like America from police states like North Korea. As a senator from the live free or die state, this matters a lot to me and my constituents and to all Americans. So, Secretary Noem, do you support the core protection that habeas corpus provides, that the government must provide a public reason in order to detain and imprison someone?
Yeah, I support habeas corpus. I also recognize that the President of the United States has the authority under the Constitution to decide if it should be suspended or not.
It has never
Let us be clear, though,
it has never been done. It has never been done without approval of Congress. Even Abraham Lincoln got retroactive approval from Congress.
So then she hears that retroactive approval of Congress. So then when she's asked the question by Senator Kim, she, and you can tell, like, this is Kristi Noem's skill, if you want to call it that. She heard that. So then when Senator Kim asks her about it, she's like, and it's like a kid who didn't practice, like who didn't study. And they're like trying to figure out like what to say in class. Then she goes, well, it's like Abraham Lincoln retroactive. And she doesn't know what article it's in. And this is a big deal, Harry, because Article 1 is the powers of Congress. And that's where the privilege of habeas corpus is described, and under what circumstances it can be suspended for rebellion or invasion is what it says.
I wanted to just go back to something that was raised earlier about habeas corpus. Can you confirm to us that you understand that any suspension of habeas corpus requires an act of Congress?
President Lincoln executed habeas corpus in the past with retroactive action by Congress. I believe that any president that was able to do that in the past, it should be afforded to our current day president. This president has never said he's going to do this. He's never communicated to me or his administration that they're going to consider suspending habeas corpus, but I do think the Constitution allows them the right to consider it.
When we saw what happened with, how many times has habeas corpus been suspended in our country?
Once that I know of.
4 times.
For certain. I'm not certain if those were.
The instance that you were referring to was one where the courts subsequently showed that Congress is the one that has the ability. Do you know what section of the Constitution the suspension clause of habeas corpus is in?
I do not. Nope.
Do you know which article it is in?
No, I do not, sir.
Okay, well, it is in Article 1. Do you know which branch of government Article 1 outlines the tasks and the responsibilities for?
Yes.
Which one?
Congress.
Yes.
I mean, come on, Harry. Come on, Harry.
She flunks. Breathtaking. Look, it's not as if they were quizzing her on what's a bill of attainder or even what's equal protection. This is the very issue and entitlement that everyone has been litigating and thinking about for 2 months at least, since they sent the people off to Venezuela on March 15th. And the DHS has been involved. They had one of their cases where Department of Defense said, oh, you can't, the order went to the government, but it was for Department of Defense. DHS did it differently. It is mind-boggling to not know. By the way, a very quick thing about Lincoln. Yeah, everybody understands it's in Article 1. Everybody understands, scholars on all sides of the aisle, that it can only be done by Congress. There's some dispute about whether Lincoln's action was unconstitutional or okay because it was retroactively validated, but it is a total irrelevancy. And even the way she put it, was just illiterate. And this is not, that you have to have constitutional scholars in the entire cabinet, but people who are dealing every day with the rights of whether or not you can deport people, whether or not you have to give them, this is habeas corpus that she seems not to be aware of, give them some notice, we want to deport you, and an opportunity to be heard by a court. That is not so hard a concept. And, she was obviously faking it and on thin ice even about the things she could say. You mentioned Dennis Miller. It's the same. Somehow they are the people who are being kicked out front to give the legal policies of this administration. And then, of course, you go into court. And the attorneys can't say that because it's a joke. And so they get their heads handed to them by a judge. And that's the way it has to work. But the breathtaking ignorance of somebody who, this has to be the number one thing. If she knows nothing else in the Constitution, she should know this, because otherwise she could just do as they've done, just ship people down with no notice, no opportunity to be heard, the very thing the court has said you may not do. By the way, the court said it unanimously. Stephen Miller told Trump they said the other thing unanimously. I mean, you're very kind, Ben, I think, to say they're talking to them like slow school children. The opinion you were showing, if you look at pages 2 and pages 4, we don't have to get into the fine grain, but the court is talking to them like they are not very honest school children. They are taking them to task for the maneuvering they're doing, including acting dumb. And, I don't know whether she's acting dumb or just doesn't know things, but that level of knowledge of that most basic of rights is horrifying, however it arises.
Look, I'm not trying to give Alito and Thomas any credit at all, so let me say that clearly. Yeah. But even though that was a 7-2 decision.
No, I'm talking about the 9-zip one where they have to give some notice and opportunity. Even Alito and Thomas are on that one. Sorry, go ahead.
They're on that one. But where Alito and Thomas veered a little bit, right, was not on that one, but on the other issue of, we didn't have jurisdiction in this specific case because, and they were basically saying, come on, Donald, like, we're trying to use these words. We're supposed to give deference to the executive branch. The federal court here, didn't make a ruling, but, you had told the federal court you were not going to deport this next group of victims to El Salvador. So, it was a kind of a coded message I felt as well, which is when it comes to this due process, we're not going to support you at all. And you've made, and it almost felt like they were saying, you're making us look stupid. Like, we're trying to help you. You're kind of making us look stupid here without saying it. I think that's how John Sauer, the Solicitor General, has to understand that was the message. But maybe I'm reading it into too much. Harry, anything else you want to say?
Look, Sauer, here's a very good example. Remember the poor attorney who'd been there 15 years and actually stood up and said, oops, we sent Abrego Garcia by mistake. Pam Bondi fires him, puts him on suspended leave, then fires him. But Sauer says the same thing in court. Last week in the birthright citizenship case, he took what had a very far-fetched position that can't fly on the substance of the birthright citizenship. Yeah, he's someone who knows well enough. Of course, he's the only guy in government who the law says must be learned in the law. But I just want to repeat, this is not some arcane thing. This is if you know one thing as Department of Homeland Security, especially now after the month of the Trump administration bobbing and weaving and saying the dog ate it and trying to get out of their obligations, it has to be that you cannot just deport somebody without giving them due process, meaning habeas corpus. If she had said that much, at least we would have known she knows the basic primer, like page 1, that could at least get her to pass your exam, Ben. This is like back to the beginning of the class, please. You don't know anything except you're the person that's doing it and executing constitutional rights and determining if people have them before they're sent away from this country into God knows where.
Good lawyers had to build a reputation to become a good lawyer, right? We've had to work with others, defense counsel, judges, mediators, arbitrators, and for at least under our current system, for you to get to a position, even in a Trump administration, where you're like a John Sauer, you've gone through a boot camp that top lawyers have had to go through. Now, we're fighting to keep this system because a meritocracy is important. Trump wants to break it down, bringing this hot take full circle. He wants the non-lawyers and the bad lawyers and the bad reputation lawyers to control. But what we're still seeing now is a dynamic. And this could be fleeting, especially as Trump makes more judicial appointments. But the dynamic now is those Trump first-term judges, not all of them, there's some bad ones, like Judge Eileen Cannon. But by and large, they're still smart, top law school, clerked kind of type people. And now the lawyers who argue before them were trained under people like that. So we have the old coach who's now, the Hall of Famer, now dealing with the coaches. So it's still from this system of American jurisprudence. But what Trump's trying to attack is DOJ, you can't go in front of the American Bar Association. They say the ABA, which is a nonpartisan, you're a leftist organization. So that's the dichotomy we're dealing with, Harry Litman.
And let me make one final point, please, Ben. I prepared cabinet level people for hearings in front of Congress. Somebody spent hours with HABA, with binders, etc. The possibility that there's nothing about habeas corpus in there is zero. So again, a remedial student or a purposeful kind of obfuscator, because that's also part of what's going on. When you go to court, you can't get away with any old crap at all. But I think he purposely likes, whether or not they, that's their notion, for people to come out and make these ridiculous claims, and maybe it sinks into the water somehow, and people think, oh, it's all up to the president, and the like. But just this other point that they had to prep her and heavy for this, and she comes out with this unbelievable blunder about the very nature of habeas corpus. We are in some weird and wacky times, to say the least.
Good question. The way the questioning was done by Senator Hassan was great also, because right, what Noam was trying to then, talk over her, and Hassan really broke it down. Give me the answers, give me the answers, give me the answers. And it was clear that Noam had no clue. And then she kind of sank back into it. It was an interesting power dynamic for someone who really kind of evaluates posture, behavior. It was an interesting thing to watch. Anyway,
I need 10 more seconds, because that's an illustration of some things that fans can do. Booker standing up for 25 hours. Kim and her having a really deft kind of fillet of Noam, and that goes over the TV. That's the kind of semi-official action they can take to bring home the message to the American people that the people who are running the show don't know the first thing about, how to even open the curtain.
Harry Litman runs the Talking Feds YouTube channel, the Talking Feds Substack, and the Talking Feds podcast. Please subscribe to all of them. It's where I get my legal news from. Thank you, Harry.
Thanks, Ben.
Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch and help us blow past 1 million followers.